Hello, 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 everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back. We're going to be starting Chapter 9 in Beyond Religion by the Dalai Lama. Chapter 9 is a longer chapter, and rightfully so, because we're going to be talking about dealing with destructive emotions. At the heart of every single person on this planet, I think that the thing we struggle with the most is destructive emotions, whether it's toward ourselves or toward others. It is a really important thing to tackle, especially if you are on a journey of self-improvement and being more mindful and being more loving and compassionate. And I think that with the tools to be able to tackle the destructive emotions, which is mastering your thoughts and being mindful of your thoughts, a lot of other things can fall into place a little bit easier for us in practicing just self-improvement overall, even if it's not really a spiritual aspect that you're working on, but even if it's just about improving yourself from a practical aspect. So let's go ahead. We're going to read the first half of Chapter 9. Dealing with destructive emotions. If, as I have suggested, the key to human happiness lies in our own state of mind, so too do the primary obstacles to that happiness. Without a doubt, the greatest impediments to our individual well-being and our ability to live a spiritually fulfilling life are our own persistent propensities toward destructive or afflictive emotions. Such emotions are the real enemies of human happiness and the ultimate source of all destructive human behavior. Tackling these negative emotions is an important goal of ethical and spiritual practice. But before offering some practical suggestions as to how we might go about dealing with these destructive tendencies and reducing their grip on our daily habits and behavior, I must first address the question of whether this is a realistic goal. Do we human beings actually have the ability to change ourselves from within? I think that's a resounding yes, but you have to want it, obviously. Just like anything in life, you have to want it and you have to work at it. And putting those two together in such a high-paced, fast world, working on within when everything is so structured to focus without is definitely a challenge. The possibility of self-improvement. The world religions have long recognized that we humans have the capacity to change from within. But in a purely secular context, demonstrating the reality of this capacity can be challenging. A committed a committed materialist, for instance, may argue that we are completely determined by biology, or to use a contemporary phrase, that we are hardwired in certain ways. In such a view, some people are determined by nature to be angry, while others are naturally more inclined toward kindness. Some are genetically disposed to be optimistic, while others have an innate propensity for depression. Given that many of our characteristic traits do indeed seem to be inherited, and that afflicted emotions like anger, hatred, and jealousy are part of our nature, it may also be right that there is nothing we can do about them. That's actually not true. Your brain is totally elastic at any age, and with retraining, you certainly can. And it's also been scientifically proven that while, yes, depression and anxiety can be inherited, they can also be changed. They are not they're pre-genetically disposed, but they are also changeable. So let's go ahead and, sorry, I'll keep going. And I lost my place. Okay, so we may feel perhaps it really is impossible to change the mental disposition we are born with. If there really were nothing we could do about our emotions, we would truly be slaves to them. However, evidence is gradually emerging from science, especially psychology and neuroscience, to suggest that it is possible to achieve meaningful change in our emotional and behavioral patterns through conscious effort. Of course, as I've said before, I myself am no scientist. Nevertheless, for many years, I have been discussing these issues with experts. From these conversations, it seems that the recent discovery of what is called brain plasticity may well offer a scientific explanation for this possibility of meaningful change. Researchers have observed that patterns and structures of the brain can and do change over time in response to our thoughts and experiences. Moreover, scientists are now able to observe the interaction between those parts of the brain associated with higher cognitive activities, such as rational thought in the prefrontal cortex, and those parts known as the limbic system, including the almond-shaped amygdala, which are associated with our most primitive instinctual and emotional reflexes. These advances in neuroscience have prompted many scientists to give serious attention to the idea that, through our own conscious efforts, we may be able to train our emotional instincts by literally altering the physical patterns in our brain. Research in this area is still quite new, but it seems to me that it may potentially provide the committed materialist with grounds for hope as strong as the faith of the religious believer. The world of emotions. Interestingly, in the classic Buddhist science of mind in which I am trained, there is no concept of emotion as a single category that precisely corresponds to the understanding of emotion in contemporary Western psychology. Indeed, there is no word in either Sanskrit or classical Tibetan that exactly translates the word emotion. Instead, all mental states are understood to include both cognitive and feeling dimensions to some degree, and to contain 5 omnipresent mental factors, of which feeling is one. The other 4 are discrimination, volition, attention, and contact. So even a cognitive mental process as simple as counting from 1 to 10 is regarded as having some kind of feeling or feeling tone, which naturally is related to context. There are also various ways of categorizing our emotional states. For example, in contemporary psychology, the main distinction is often drawn between emotional states, which on the one hand are pleasurable or joyful and are described as positive, and those which on the other hand are unpleasant or painful and are described as negative. In classical Buddhist psychology, however, the distinction is rather different. Instead, the primary distinction is not between those states which are pleasurable and those that are painful, but between those that are beneficial and those that are harmful. Afflictive mental states, known as nangmong in Tibetan or klesha in Sanskrit, are those which undermine our long-term well-being, while non-afflictive mental states are those which have no such destructive impact. Given these different ways of categorizing emotional experience, it is important for readers not to confuse those emotions which are afflictive, that is to say, harmful to our long-term well-being, with those which simply don't feel good. Of course, sometimes these overlap. Feelings of hatred, for example, are both destructive and unpleasant to experience. But there can also be experiences which may not be pleasant, but can nevertheless be beneficial. And in the same way, there can be feelings that are pleasant, which nevertheless can be destructive. For instance, feelings of sadness, grief, and remorse are certainly not pleasurable, but they need not in themselves be afflictive. When faced, say, with the death of a loved one, feelings of grief and sorrow may actually be quite constructive in helping us come to terms with our loss and to move on with our lives. In the same way, emotions which may initially seem pleasurable can nevertheless be destructive at a deeper level by undermining our mental peace and stability. One example might be lust or excessive longing for a particular object. Such longing may in some sense seem pleasurable, but eventually obsessive craving will erode our capacity for genuine contentment and undermine our mental equilibrium, and should therefore be considered destructive. In the context of secular ethics, this distinction between those mental states which undermine well-being, our own and that of others, and those which promote survival and well-being can be very useful, since it is directly relevant to our pursuit of happiness and an ethically sound way of life. Given that people come from many different backgrounds and cultures, which states are to be considered destructive and which are to be considered beneficial may vary in particular cases. Generally speaking, we can define destructive emotions as those states which undermine our well-being by creating inner turmoil, thereby undermining self-control and depriving us of mental freedom. Within this, it is also possible to distinguish between two subcategories: those emotional states that are destructive in themselves, such as greed, hatred, or malice, and those states such as attachment, anger, or fear, which only become destructive when their intensity is disproportionate to the situation in which they arise. From a biological perspective, all our basic emotions evidently have evolutionary purposes. For example, attachment helps bring us together and enables us to create bonds. Anger helps repel forces that are detrimental to our survival and well-being. Fear enables us to respond to a threat with vigilance. And envy prompts us to compete with others so that we do not overlook our own needs. Scientists have demonstrated that these basic emotions have clear biological dimensions. When we face an immediate danger, for example, and fear arises, extra blood rushes to our legs, and with increased adrenaline and our hearts beating faster, the emotion of fear literally prepares us to flee. In contrast, when anger arises, more blood goes to our arms, preparing us to confront the threat. So the important point to bear in mind is that these feelings are not destructive in themselves. They become destructive only when their intensity is out of proportion to the situation, or when they arise in situations that do not call for them. As for attachment, which, after all, is the feeling that holds families and communities together, we do not usually think of it as destructive. However, when this basic emotion becomes excessive and wants to control its object, it does become destructive. This is true also for desire. In itself, desire is not destructive. After all, without desire, the human race would cease to exist altogether. In fact, desire is the emotion that drives many of our day-to-day activities, from getting up in the morning to eating, working, and pursuing our immediate and long-term goals in life. Similarly, even anger is not always destructive. For example, in some situations, strong compassion may give rise to an equally strong sense of outrage, that is, anger, about an injustice in particular. Again, feeling angry can, in the short term, make our minds more focused and give us an extra burst of energy and determination. In these ways, anger can, in certain situations, make us more effective in getting things done and in obtaining what we rightly seek. However, when anger extends beyond this practical function, most of the energy it brings us is not helpful at all. Since all of us have probably at one time or another been on the receiving end of other people's anger, we all have experience of its unpleasant consequences. However, while anger may sometimes have a constructive element, hatred never does. Hatred is always destructive. Like anger, fear is not destructive in every situation. Fear makes us more attentive and guards us against danger. It is also a powerful motivating factor, forcing us to be cautious and to take care of our well-being. But when fear is obsessive, it can paralyze us and become a very destructive mental condition. Furthermore, excessive fear gives rise to a persistent state of anxiety, which is harmful to our health. I therefore often distinguish between reasonable fear and unreasonable fear. The first kind is not only legitimate, but actually necessary to our survival. If a mad dog comes running at us, we need to respond to this danger with fear. This is obvious. In contrast, unreasonable fear occurs when the source of threat is largely our own mental projection. We need to keep this kind of fear in check, for it is totally useless and often destructive. What we need to counter unreasonable fear is a better understanding of the situation at hand. This dual aspect of emotions, that all of them have destructive and non-destructive sides, can also be seen in other mental states such as doubt, shame, grief, competitiveness, and even our sense of ego itself. Doubt is the mental factor that enables us to inquire and seek out understanding. Indeed, I always say that a dose of skepticism is quite healthy, in that it opens our minds to questioning and new knowledge. However, when doubt becomes pathological, it can paralyze us and prevent us from taking any decisive action. The same is true of shame. At the basic level, shame is an important social emotion which has a constructive function. Nevertheless, when shame becomes extreme, it can lead to low self-regard and negative self-judgment, which are clearly not constructive. With respect to grief or sorrow, in some situations, this emotion is constructive and has a positive effect. But when it becomes something like a habit of mind, divorced from any realistic cause, it may be destructive, as when it manifests as self-absorbed grief or as depression. Competitiveness, too, can be constructive, as when our competitive urge motivates us to strive to achieve something better or higher. However, when competitiveness acquires an aspect of wanting to put others down or to hold them back so we can out-achieve them, it then becomes destructive. In egoism, too, we can distinguish between two kinds. A strong sense of self can be constructive, the basis for generating self-confidence, the state of mind that allows us to feel, yes, I can do this. But another form of egoism is evident when, in pursuing our own self-interest, we become totally oblivious to others' welfare and even willing to exploit others to benefit ourselves. This type of egoism is clearly destructive. So when we are dealing with matters as subtle as human mental processes, it is important not to be too dogmatic. It is difficult or impossible to determine whether or not a given mental state is destructive without knowing its context. Often we can make this determination only by taking into account the underlying motivation, the specific object of the emotion, the consequences of the emotion, and so on. In the area of the human mind, therefore, we should always maintain an attitude of open-mindedness, pragmatism, and flexibility. Shared features of destructive emotions. One feature that characterizes all destructive emotions is a tendency to distort our perception of reality. They cause us to narrow our perspective so that we fail to see a given situation in its wider context. For example, when we are feeling an extreme form of attachment, such as an intense desire, lust, or greed, often we are projecting a level of attractiveness onto the object of our desire, which far exceeds what really is there. We become blind even to quite obvious shortcomings. And in our obsessive clinging, we create a kind of insecurity in ourselves, a feeling that we need to obtain the object of our desire and are incomplete without it. Excessive attachment tends also to involve a desire to control, which can be very suffocating when the object of that desire happens to be another person. Because of this, extreme attachment is by nature quite unstable. One moment we may feel great affection for something or someone, but when, for example, our desire for control is thwarted, this feeling can easily turn to resentment or hatred. A similar loss of perspective characterizes extreme or intense emotions of aversion, such as anger, hatred, contempt, or resentment. When we are gripped by intense anger, for example, the object of our rage will always appear 100% negative, even though in moments of calm we may recognize that the same person or thing has many admirable qualities. The overly strong emotion causes us to lose our capacity for discernment. We cannot see the long and short-term consequences of our actions, and as a result, we are unable to distinguish between what right and wrong. We literally, for a moment, become almost mad, incapable of acting in our own best interest. And then, after the event, when the emotions cool, how often we regret what we have done or said in anger. Boy, that is really true. On a trip to Sweden some years ago, I had a lengthy conversation with Dr. Aaron Beck, one of the founding fathers of cognitive behavior therapy, a major branch of modern psychotherapy which has been quite effective in treating behavioral problems and depression. When we met, Dr. Beck was in his early 80s. It was very interesting to me how close many of his observations were to the insights of classical Buddhist psychology. For example, he said that in intense anger, almost 90% of the quality of repulsiveness we see in the object of our anger is an exaggeration and a projection. This is in close accord with the understanding found in classical Buddhist texts. The point about all these afflictive mental states is that, in one way or another, they obscure our vision by clouding our capacity for discernment. They make us incapable of rational judgment, and thus, we might say, they steal our minds. The emotion families. I think this is the last section that we will read. Yes, this is half of the chapter. One helpful approach to understanding our destructive emotions is to view them as related families distinguished by the kind of underlying state of mind they involve. For example, as I have said, the emotions of the anger family, such as hatred, enmity, and malice, are characterized by an exaggerated repulsion, while those of the attachment family, such as greed, lust, and craving, are characterized by an equally exaggerated sense of attraction. The other main families of afflictive emotions, envy, pride, and doubt, involve mixtures of excessive attraction on the one hand, such as the excessive attachment to a deluded self-image in the case of pride, and excessive repulsion on the other, such as the excessive sense of enmity toward a rival in the case of envy. As we have already seen, in addition to this element of excessive revulsion or attraction or unhealthy mixtures of the two, all afflictive emotions are further characterized by an unrealistic or deluded perspective. Envy is a somewhat complex family of afflictions, since its root lies in attachment and attraction, yet it also has a strong element of anger, hostility, and repulsion. Recent scientific research on happiness has found that one of the primary sources of discontent in today's world, especially in the more affluent societies, is our human tendency to compare ourselves to those around us. Fundamentally, this comes down to the problem of envy. That's very true too. The afflictive family of pride or conceit, which includes destructive attitudes such as arrogance, pride, and even obsessive or unrealistic embarrassment, also involves a mixture of attraction and repulsion. Attraction, for example, to an unrealistic or deluded self-image, and repulsion or disdain toward anyone or anything that threatens that cherished self-image. This attachment to an inflated self-image, whether based on social status, accomplishment, or the circumstances of our birth, may prompt us to take actions that are disrespectful of others, and such actions are destructive both to the welfare of others and to ourselves. Finally, there is the family of afflictive doubt, which encompasses such destructive emotions as anxiety and obsessive guilt. These are grounded in habitual fear and an unrealistic self-loathing, which are very damaging to our ability to be compassionate. Emotions of the afflictive doubt family can therefore be highly detrimental to our own sense of well-being. These then are the destructive emotions which I consider the main obstacles to human well-being, not only our own individual well-being, but also that of those around us and ultimately that of the very world we share. These emotions fundamentally undermine our capacity to put positive ethical values, such as compassion, into practice. Only when we fully recognize the negative repercussions of such destructive emotions and expose their futility and impracticality as responses will we be able to go about tackling them effectively. Our inner development with regard to regulating our destructive emotions calls for a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we must seek to reduce the impact of the destructive potentials that are inherent within us. On the other hand, we must seek to enhance the positive qualities that also naturally exist within us. This two-pronged approach to mental training is what I consider to be the heart of genuine spiritual practice. Okay, so that's the first half of Chapter 9, and we will read the rest of Chapter 9 in my next video. So I'm going to get into bed. It is late and I have to work tomorrow. But as usual, I wanted to hop on and read to you since I'm reading it to myself. So until next time, until we meet again, please take care of yourself. Please take care of those around you. And I will see you very soon for the last half of chapter 9. Okay? Take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.